your messages. You have 30 minutes to move your car. You have 10 minutes. Your car has been impounded. Your car has been crushed into a cube. You have 30 minutes to move your cube. Hello, Mr. Burns' office.
Is it about my cube? 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 Is it about my cube?
Just like Sylvia Plath or Elliott Smith, we are turning our depression into great art. Our great art is speaking into microphones about magic cards. This is Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with Anthony Goblin Robblemaster Maddox. Hi, Anthony.
Why am I a Robblemaster? Isn't that a McDonald's thing?
I robbed you of your Goblin Rabblemaster. That's where it came from.
Please don't talk about that.
You waited until, let's see, what round is this?
I had a perfect strategy. I was,
the 39th pick of 45. You want to defend your strategy?
I didn't think this was going to happen.
Did you really not think it was going to happen?
I thought that I was drafting with reasonable people, and I've just been attacked.
I was like, I already had taken like 3 or 4 picks that were just strictly sideboard cards. And then I was like, you know what? This is lower EV than me taking these good cards from Anthony. Listeners, if you haven't picked up on what's going on, that's right. We are still not done our rotisserie draft, which has been going now for...
This is month 3 of... No, not the pandemic, of this rotisserie draft.
Of this rotisserie draft. We're all aging in place. Our fingernails are long. Our hair is growing out. And we are still finishing the draft. We are going to get it done, though, Anthony. We have just 3 picks left, it looks like. But we got to pick 39, and you took Legion Warboss, the first Rabblemaster you decided to take.
Yeah.
And then the picks following that from other players were Inferno Titan, Assassin's Trophy, which is a little bit of an outlier, then Goblin Rabblemaster, Seasoned Pyromancer, Mizium Mortars, Krenko Tin Street Kingpin, Sark and the Maxorus, and Collective Defiance, all cut from you in immediate back-to-back fashion.
Was there really there really was no discussion in whatever the Everyone But Anthony channel?
I promise you, if there is a channel where that's being discussed, I am not included. I just made the decision to cut Rabblemaster, and then the last player here seemed to follow suit, and I was already planning to take both the Rabblmasters that remained, and the fact that he happened to pick up Seasoned Pyromancer seems good. So, do you rate these? I'm very curious to know, genuinely. Do you rate these cards like relatively low? Because I mean, we're pick 39. You should have your entire main deck pretty much at this point. Do you actually rate these cards lower than the other cards you've picked ahead of them, or did you just think they were safe enough that you could kind of go for more contested sideboard picks first and then get these cards late?
I was definitely going for the sideboard picks and like things that I thought other people would actually want. I mean, I honestly was just really not expecting people to hate draft to this degree, because I thought literally no one's going to put any of those cards into their main deck. But apparently people are not as reasonable as I expected.
I mean, at this point, there's nothing I'm going to take and put in my main deck, though. So, of course, I'm going to take the best card for my opponents on average, which is 2 Rabblmasters back-to-back. So,
well,
I can't say I'm sorry, Anthony. But, so would you have main decked them is my question. Because, again, these would have been picks 40 and 41 for you, 42 for Seasoned Pyromancer. Would they have made the main?
I probably should have done more actually trying to lay out this deck and see what it looks like. I definitely prioritized the cheaper things first, in addition to obviously the things that, I thought would actually be
the colorless
contested
stuff and contested stuff, yeah.
I mean, how many 3-drops do you actually want in an aggressive deck? I mean, I have the Warboss, I have the Phoenix, I don't know if you want to count the Bone Crusher Giant and Sulfuric Vortex, but I feel like I'm...
You also have the 3-mana Chandra, so it's not that you don't have 3-drops for sure. That's a good question. I don't know. I wish I could tell you with confidence. I think it kind of depends. So something I've been thinking about a lot, and we'll get into this later, I think this will be one of the topics of the show, is because this draft is so drawn out and so protracted, it gives me an opportunity to overthink everything even more thoroughly than when I'm normally drafting. And because mono white aggro was somewhat uncontested, again, you and I split the colorless aggro cards, and I had a couple of my better removal spells and planeswalkers taken by white control players, but for the most part I kind of got my pick of the litter of the cube for mono white aggro cards, including quite a few that I'm not going to have room in the main deck for. I've been thinking about what I think the ideal build of this draft is for my deck, and trying to figure out what is the correct main deck configuration? How do I sideboard against different matchups? I think the question of how many 3-drops for you very much depends on the matchup and what you're up against, because Rabble Masters are particularly good in some instances and they're a little bit weaker in others. And so I think you'll want to go heavier on 3-drops, for example, against me in like the aggro mirror, where the 1-drops are not as valuable. Against any kind of control player, you'd love to, flood the board early as quick as possible and just try and get the pressure on before they inevitably board wipe. The Rabble Master's not as good in that matchup, I don't think. Still pretty good mid-range, though, because you can go big with them. So I think it depends on matchup, and I'm not sure. I can't figure out for my own deck, and I haven't committed anywhere near any amount of energy to figuring out for your deck either how many 3-drops you actually want. Are you that heartbroken about being cut?
It's a little bit disappointing.
Look, we're all very fragile right now. So,
Here we go. It's time to make a live pick. It is my pick. What do I take? What do I do that's interesting here? Oh, nothing. There's no interesting choice. This is just not a game for me anymore.
We're on pick 43. What do you want?
What do I want? I want those Rabble Masters.
Yeah, you can't have any of those. What do you actually pick? Is there anything you're going to play? No, there's not anything you're going to play under any circumstances, it seems like. So what's the best thing to hate draft? All the gold cards are gone now, so nothing to hate draft from Daniel. That's fine. What's the best card that no one's taking it? It has to be a black card, because people aren't really playing black.
I've got it right here.
Ooh, you're taking your favorite Snake Boy.
My favorite powerful snake lady.
Anyway, that's the update on the rotisserie draft that I'm sure all of our listeners have been just, chomping at the bit, trying to figure out what's going on with the roto draft, and that's where we're at. We are almost done, and there was some backs stabbed in these last couple rounds here, and these last picks are definitely just kind of we're just going through the paces at this point. Though I will say I am very grateful
because it wasn't like anybody planned out their entire draft strategy given the specific number of picks they had. No one would have done that, correct?
Is that what you did? You basically had a pick order for the order you were going to take all 45 cards you hope to draft in?
To some degree, yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's reasonable to expect the last 5 picks or whatever to be playables, especially in a format like this where it's all, open information. But I'm very grateful to have this document now as the Cube designer to look at this and see.
You're grateful to have this document?
Yeah.
Have you seen what it looks like? So, dear listeners, I don't know how to express the amount of spreadsheet griefing that has gone on in this particular rotisserie draft. There are background colors. There is crossed out text that's right aligned and centered, and icons, and it's everything short of actually damaging the legitimacy of the draft.
Oh, Anthony, it looks like the drafter in column 2 actually took that card already took Ophiomancer and just forgot to mark it in the other sheet. So that pick is unfortunately invalid. I'm going to have to go ahead and call the judge on it.
Judge?
Wee woo, wee woo, wee woo. Pick, please.
I'm closing the window.
All right. Yeah, no drafting on air. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in this episode, but we should jump into our Pack 1 Pick 1, Anthony. And this week we are doing the cube of a friend of ours in our play group, Allison. And Allison has a peasant cube that is it's like a very good peasant cube. We've drafted it a few times. As far as peasant cubes go, I think it's one of my favorites. And one of the things I really like about it recently is that Allison just introduced rare land fixing into the peasant cube, which is something that I am a big fan of. As a person that hates enter the battlefield tapped fixing and likes to cast my spells, I think it's cool to have peasant power level cards, but still good lands to let people cast their spells. Do you have anything to say about this draft?
That's a really cool decision because one of the things that's really defining about the way peasant cube differs from other cubes is just literally the way the cards are designed. At rare, you'll see a lot of cards that interact with many other cards at once, like wraths, and even just like a bunch of target creatures get a buff, or things that let you get like multiple cards worth of card advantage out of one card. But just at uncommon and common, the way that they design Magic cards, that's just not the case. But that same sort, and then that really, it shapes the way that the draft actually plays out and the kinds of things you have to value. But that same philosophy doesn't apply to the lands. If you look at the lands, it's just the rare lands are better. So it doesn't actually play into that interesting space of having a different kind of draft experience by adding this constraint. It just means that you also have worse fixing.
And I will say, I was talking about this on Twitter recently, and I think fixing lands, more so than any other category of cards in a cube, are fundamentally different in a way that it might make sense to violate the rules you've otherwise set for yourself. You and I have talked about how we both break singleton for lands and nothing else. Allison is here breaking rarity restrictions for lands. I think it's a good place where you can perhaps look at the restrictions you've placed on yourself that otherwise breed creativity in your card choices for the actual spells, and maybe say, well, do the lands, am I really getting more creative by also withholding myself in the lands, or am I just hamstringing my mana bases and making all of my decks slower and less consistent? And I think you'll find that good lands are good for all decks, regardless of power level and your design goals, pretty much. Anthony, what kind of stuff are you hoping to pack on Pick One from a Peasant Cube? Do you have a dream list or types of cards you're really hoping to grab?
Not so much. I mean, if I think about it, like what we were just saying, the valuable parts of, or the really valuable thing in Peasant Cube is these kind of ways to get card advantage. So something that gets a solid 2-for-1 without too much of a build around
right, a kind of requirement. Yeah, I in Peasant Cube, my changes to my card evaluation are that I value just clean 2-for-1s much more highly. I feel like 2-for-1s are always good just by definition of what it is, but I think in very fast, very powerful cube environments, a 2-for-1 is not so good if it's just too slow. So Muldrifter being a classic clean 2-for-1, that's a card that I think is very, very good in Peasant, and I think, frankly, well below rate in a powerful fast cube with fast aggro. I don't run it anymore in my cube. I wouldn't value it highly if I did. So I'm looking for 2-for-1s. I'm also taking Fixing a little more highly here, even than in powerful cubes, because I feel like playing more colors benefits me more at lower power levels, because I get to grab some of the more powerful gold cards and stuff, which actually stand in many Peasant cubes head and shoulders above the rest of the cards, and kind of do that. And those are the kind of things I value most highly. Control is interesting, I think, in Peasant cubes because you don't get board wipes, like you mentioned. So I'm conscious of any card that really is dependent on being in some sort of controlling strategy and whether or not that can actually work. And I'm usually aiming for a slower mid-rangey deck with hopefully some synergy. I think synergy is more important here than in a cube with a really pushed powerful aggro section, for example, where you're more just kind of playing flexible, powerful cards. Anyway, no more preamble. Let's dive into this pack. The first card up is Acidic Slime.
Wow, I was just looking at it, and I've never seen this promo art, and I'm adding it to my cart right now.
It's very good promo art, and it's a very clean 2-for-1.
It's a clean 2-for-1. It's a little bit conditional, and I don't know how powerful the artifacts and enchantments in this environment actually are. I think if you are, faced against an Icy Manipulator or I guess Renegade Freighter is not the train I was really worried about. But yeah, I mean, there are some powerful artifacts and enchantments, but not to the same degree that you'll see in some other environments. So it's good, but hoping to go up a little bit from there.
Yep, I think it's fine here because it's 2-for-1, but not going to first pick it, I don't think. Next up, Duskwatch Recruiter.
That one you're going to have to read for me.
All right, so this is 1 and a green for a 2-2. It has already a good rate. Yeah. It's got an activated ability. You pay 2 and a green to look at the top 3 cards of your library, and then you may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on bottom. So mana sink when you're trying to dig for more action. Then it has the horrible downside that at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells are cast, you flip it into a 3/3 that makes creatures cost 1 less to cast, and then flips back if 2 spells were cast. It's a sort of transform mechanic. It's often said that is the worst part about this card, and I think I agree. You really love the front edge. The front side is just a sort of grizzly bear with a great late-game mana sink, and it does tend to flip at inopportune moments for me, where if you're late in the game and you want that mana sink, you probably don't care that much about upgrading from a 2/2 to a 3/3, and so what's actually happening is you're turning off your mana sink, which is kind of a bummer.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, it does give your opponent some opportunity to actually play against that and control which side is available to your disadvantage. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously very powerful, and it can even be more than a 2-for-1. So I think that's definitely a higher pick for me than Acidic Slime. I do like the story it tells, this idea of, it's a cheap creature, you use it as a late-game mana sink, and then if your opponent's just out of things to do, it flips, and suddenly you have this discount, and you can spend all your mana, cast a bunch of creatures, and it flips back and turns into the way to draw into more cards, and kind of has an interesting sort of cyclic nature, which I think was something they were really trying to design to in this set. So I think that's cool.
Yeah. In my experience, too, it is possible to really kind of go off with it if you play it on turn 2 and your opponent happens to have no spells to cast, and then you get to flip it on your turn 3 and maybe cast 2 creatures and attack with a 3/3. That's big game if you have that particular start. But I agree, much higher pick than Acidic Slime for me. A good value engine, exactly what I want in a peasant cube like this. Then we have Charging Monstrosaur.
Ooh, so clean, so tidy. It's very strong. I think it's a little bit lower for me. Just the mana cost difference, I think, is still relevant in this context.
Yep, I agree, and it's not a 2-for-1. I mean, it sounds like a broken record, but it is just a very reasonable, well-costed threat. But there's Doomblades in this environment still. It's peasant, so we still have efficient removal, and I'm not really interested in playing a 5-mana 1-for-1 in this environment, potentially.
You wouldn't put it in your deck even if you got it later in a pack and you're playing a red heavy deck?
No, I would. I know I have played this exact Charging Monstrosaur in this exact cube and been reasonably happy with it, but yeah, it's kind of like a late pack thing for me, or like a curve filler if I happen to be short on 5s. So I don't expect to be short on 5s in this particular peasant cube. So yeah. Anyway, now we have a very different kind of synergy card. We have Goblin Bombardment.
So this lets you sack creatures to shock things?
2-mana enchantment, sack a creature to deal 1 damage to any target.
1 damage.
So it is a free sack outlet, and oftentimes a piece of various aristocrats strategies, or potentially a win condition for a token deck that is otherwise stalled on board. Yeah, it's interesting build around, and definitely signals to me that there is some kind of sacrifice aristocrats thing going on in this cube, or at least an attempt at it.
Yeah, I haven't seen that play out so much, so I'm not quite excited. I'd have to see that sort of like proven to me before I take that pretty highly, but I could see it going up.
I agree. I don't rate it very highly here. Some people do like this card a lot because it does sometimes read, it's kind of like Fling, where sometimes it just wins you a game out of nowhere because you just pay 2 mana and then you deal 6 damage to your opponent by sacrificing all of your creatures. There are cute synergies. I believe oh no, I guess that's a rare, not uncommon. It has cute synergies with token creators. Some token creators that make tokens that get exiled end of turn anyway, and then they just now deal extra damage to stuff. But that kind of synergy, even though I think this is a cube where that synergy is more relevant than in more powerful cubes that aren't rarity restricted, I'm not going to start my draft on such a narrow build around. I would take this mid-pack if I felt like I was already getting other important pieces for it that I thought could make it work, but I'm not convinced enough of its floor and its baseline value to take it early.
Yeah.
Next up is Dissipate. That is a cancel, but it exiles the spell instead of just putting it into their graveyard.
Seems fine, not super exciting.
Yeah, I'm not going to start on a 3-mana counterspell. Wall of Omens.
Also fine. It is a 2-for-1, but I don't know if this is a context where you really need to be that defensive early. So, yeah, I think I'm still a Duskwatch Recruiter over that.
Yeah, this is a card that does fit a couple of the things I said I'm looking for in a card in the Peasant Cube, in that it is a 2-for-1. It is something that enables me to be like the bigger mid-range deck. Throwing an 0-4 down is going to stop any kind of version of faster mid-range pretty much in its tracks, because 4 toughness is really hard to get through. You're going to save a lot of life that way. And then it also has a blink synergy thing going on, which I know there to be some blink support in this cube. The fact that it buys you time until you get your engine online and then is part of that engine itself by drawing you cards, I think is quite good. That said, I'm still on Duskwatch Recruiter personally, because Duskwatch Recruiter kind of has a lot of the same value proposition, but entirely self-contained, whereas this Wall of Omens has potential to do a lot if it is in the right deck. But Duskwatch Recruiter kind of just does it on its own, so I'm going to start there. Plague Crafter. Do you know this one by heart, Anthony?
I do know it, and I really love it. What do you think in this particular context, though? I mean, I guess my question is, how many cards do we have, like Slimefoot, where you just, like, blow your opponent out by playing this thing, which gives -1/-1 to a particular creature type? Are you
Plague Crafter?
Oh, Plague Crafter. I'm so sorry.
Plague Engineer is what you're thinking of. Plague Crafter. This is the Fleshbag Marauder variant. Yeah, so it's 2 and a black for a 3/2, and when it enters the battlefield, each player, you included, sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, and each player who can't discards a card. So a big upgrade over Fleshbag Marauder and Merciless Executioner, which are functional duplicates, and they're both just 3/1s that cause both players to sacrifice a creature. This one does a bunch of other stuff, which interacts with more card types and whatnot, and has a better stat line. But
most importantly, you can just play it on an empty board, and it still does something.
It will sacrifice itself.
Yes, and make your opponent discard a card. No.
Yes, it will do that. Yeah, that is true. So it is something, though not great, I imagine. 3 mana, they discard a card of their choice. Doesn't feel like a very good spell to me.
No. I mean, maybe if you have a token that you don't mind throwing away, it can become relevant. I mean, those edge cases are good to have. I think I'm still pretty low on this, actually. Edicts are a little bit finicky. Yeah.
I expect it performs well in the cube, and it's another indicator to me of some kind of sacrificey aristocrats theme, involving tokens or whatnot, which we have the Goblin Bombardment to also potentially point to. Those cards feel like they belong to the same family. But I'm not going to start there. Still Recruiter for me. Anthony, a favorite of yours, Oketra's Monument.
Ooh, I do like Oketra's Monument. So the question I want to ask about Oketra's Monument is it more flexible than Duskwatch Recruiter, specifically in the sense that am I just going to put this into any deck, or is this definitely just a white card?
You can answer that question for yourself. I'm not putting this in any deck. I mean, it's 3 generic mana to then make a 1/1 every time you cast a creature spell, 1/1 with Vigilance specifically. So I would need to, basically trigger this 3 times before I'm happy with the rate I've paid, and the sort of tempo loss I'm taking is significant. So for me, this is actually a pretty high commitment card. Like, I would almost think of this as like, if I'm in very, very heavy white or mono white, I'm very happy with this card. And if I'm even just like 2 colors, one of them white and even split, I'm a lot less happy with it at that point.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. Like a Hordling Outburst that you don't get the creatures for, 3 turns minimum.
Many turns,
is pretty rough. I mean, there is the combo potential with at least Core Skyfisher, but even with that, that's obviously extremely narrow. So I'd be happy to have it, in heavy white deck, or if I have those specific cards. But first pick, it seems less necessary.
Light up the stage.
Light up the stage. I feel like in our play group, people often don't like to play red, so that makes me a little bit tempted. And it's a pretty strong red card. I think that's actually honestly pretty close.
I'm still in Duskwatch Recruiter, personally. We've talked about this a couple times, and I feel like we should formalize a term for these kind of cards, but Light Up the Stage is of the class of cards that is great in an already very functional, aggressive deck, but does not make your deck good, which is the same as a lot of other support cards, a lot of equipment, a lot of, stuff that like a Goblin Bombardment is another good example. Like, I would probably put Goblin Bombardment in almost any aggressive deck that I had, but Goblin Bombardment does not make the deck good. The deck has to be good already, has to have lots of cheap threats and be able to put pressure on the opponent, and then it gets the luxury of playing Goblin Bombardment or Light Up the Stage and really getting full value out of them. But I don't want to take those cards early because I don't know if I'm going to have that deck, and I would much rather get them late because I only want a couple of them in my deck, and I'd rather just make sure I prioritize the cheap threats to make the deck good, and then get those kind of I guess they're kind of like aggro payoffs, like Light Up the Stage is in some ways to aggro what, some Blink Enabler is to a Blink deck, or like a good enter the battlefield creature, where it's like, this will be like a thing you'll really benefit from once you have the right shell, but without it, you're not sure where you're headed yet.
So if you were to take a red card here, let's say your hands are tied between Charging Monster Sword, Goblin Bombardment, and Light Up the Stage, where would you be happiest to start?
I guess Monster Sword, probably.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's right.
I mean, Monster Sword is a single red at 5 mana. The other ones are also a single red, but they're, I guess a Goblin Bombardment is actually very splashable too, because you're happy to play that late in most circumstances. But Monster Sword is easy to cast and has a very, very, very... I mean, the floor and the ceiling are basically the same. It is a very consistently performing card. Basically, the question is, do they have instant speed removal or not? And if they don't, they're, taking 5 with haste. The other ones just require too much build around that I'm not happy taking them first.
Right. All right, what's next?
Borderland Marauder. Do you know that one?
Ooh, not quite, no.
It's a 2-mana 1/2 for 1 and a red that attacks as a 3/2.
So it's pretty narrow in that it's just an aggressive card. I think that, I mean, despite what we just said, and I think what I agree with, I think I would still be happier taking Light Up the Stage over that, just because I fit in the same deck, but it seems like Light Up the Stage is going to be a much scarcer resource. But I think that still doesn't push out the Recruiter for me.
Yeah, I'm still in Recruiter as well. If you told me that I had to force red aggro in this draft, I would start on the Marauder so far.
Really? Okay.
Just because it's so important to me to have those cheap creatures that... my deck can be good without any Light Up the Stages. My deck cannot be good if I don't have enough 2-drops. So I'm just going to prioritize the cheap creatures as much as I possibly can, and then get whatever I get in terms of payoffs. If you told me I had to force mono red aggro, but I would not want to do that given this pack. Here's a contender, Anthony. Soul Herder.
Oh my god. Well, we talked about Blink with the Wall of Omens. I think that Soul Hoarder is probably the strongest card in this pack, but I don't think it justifies being a gold card for a pick one.
Interesting. I feel like this is that's something I would normally say, but here
really?
I think it is entirely worth it, and I'm taking the Soul Herder.
Wow. Okay.
I think that so removal is not scarce in this environment, but we've just seen this pack, and what the removal looks like is we have stuff like Goblin Bombardment, we have Plaguecrafter. There are plenty of clean removal spells too, but this is a value engine the likes of which, if it is unanswered for even a couple turns, is almost guaranteed to run away with the game in an environment where you don't have board wipes and you don't have some of the broken rare level answers. So I'm very happy to take that. I think it's worth being gold, and I would also be very happy to splash it in a deck, because I think late this can also be very relevant. So I could end up blue-green, I could end up white-green, green being a color that's especially good with their battlefield abilities. It's possible to be some other color combination too, but I'm going to take it, prioritize fixing, and try and basically go off with the Soul Herder is my plan.
Okay.
Now we have our first rare, Llanowar Wastes.
So this is the
That's
black...
the Golgari Painland.
Black-green Painland. I still don't think I'm... Yeah, I mean, I still think of a gold card like this as a hybrid card. It's only... I mean, not as a hybrid card. As a gold card. It's only going to make it in my deck if I'm exactly black-green. And this isn't an environment where I expect to be playing 3+ colors. So I'm fairly low on taking those early. Obviously, once I know I'm in a certain color pair, they go way up in value.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. I also think of these strict dual lands, that are not fetchable, that, can't ever fix for other colors as gold cards. I will say that the fact that one of those colors is green makes me more attracted to this, being that green is one of the decks that is most able to splash for a little bit in a couple other colors and be the base of a 3-color deck or something. And the fact that this is a Peasant Cube, where, again, I think the gold cards are very good. I think playing the best, most powerful cards you can get your hands on is going to be a good strategy. This is my pick after Soul Herder. I'm still going to take Soul Herder, but this is the next best card in the pack for me, followed up by Duskwatch Recruiter. I just am happy to take Fixing, I think, here.
Okay.
And that answer is the same as it would be if this was just, a black-green, tap land or whatever the best Fixing is at actual Peasant rarity. It's not because it's a rare land that I value it any higher. I just think Fixing is good in this environment. Callous Dismissal.
Ooh.
That's our 2-mana 1/1 Manowar. Return a permanent to its owner's hand and amass 1 non-land permanent.
I like it. So I'm still, I think, on Duskwatch Recruiter. So my question now is between... I think Callous Dismissal is definitely a contender. So the question is, what's more important in this context? Early interaction or late game value? I think
it's late game value. What's your answer, though?
I think I'm still on Duskwatch Recruiter here. I think this environment is... It could easily slip in either direction, and if, there were a few more cards pushed in a more aggressive direction, Callous Dismissal could go much higher in value. But yeah, I think most games are going to revolve around value rather than tempo.
Yeah, I agree. I think of Peasant as a very value-oriented environment. I would rate the Duskwatch Recruiter much higher than the Callous Dismissal, just because it's for the cost of a card, it doesn't do that much. It's a 1/1, it temporarily bounces something, but the chances that you are able to bounce something and then immediately swing for the win, or you're able to bounce something very important early that your opponent is putting on a lot of pressure with and save a lot of life or whatever, is less likely here than it would be in a much faster environment or something. So I'm still on the cards I like, but I think Recruiter is higher than the Dismissal for me as well.
And it only
two cards left.
Targets creatures your opponents control, correct? So you can't rescue something from a pacifism.
Any non-land permanent.
Any non-permanent. Okay.
It's a sorcery, though, so there's no rescuing anything.
Right, okay.
Yeah, it's like a Manowar, basically, because it is at sorcery speed the same way a creature is.
Right.
Two cards left. We have Sentinel of the Eternal Watch. I'm going to read this one just because I myself don't often know what this one does. I have to read it every time it's played against me. This is 5 and a white for a creature, Giant Soldier. It's a 4/6 with Vigilance. And at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, tap target creature that player controls. How do you rate this big old brawler?
What was the cost again?
5 and a white.
5 and a white. I think that I'm still on just taking a cheaper card earlier. I don't think that.
I also like taking cheaper cards earlier. This is not going to nudge into my top 3, but it might be my 4th pick in the pack. Like I said, I'm happy to be like a very big mid-range deck here, and while this is not a 2-for-1 in any like traditional sense, a 4/6 with Vigilance is going to negate a lot of attacks and blocks, which is like a bunch of virtual card advantage. It's just a very good body. And then the fact that you get to tap something down means that you often, like, the chances you can't attack with this every turn on most boards are very slim, because you get to tap their best blocker down, and then you have a 4/6 with Vigilance you can just kind of bash with for free. I have been beaten to pieces by this card in like 4 and 5 color decks, and the fact that it's only 1 white and it's 6 mana means it's very splashable. So I like this card a lot in this environment, but I'm not going to start on a 6-drop unless this pack was lacking the really good cards like Recruiter and Soul Herder and Llanowar Wastes.
Yeah.
Last card. Let's see if Anthony changes his mind. It's a Weaver of Lightning.
Ooh, this one is so familiar. This was in Jumpstart.
I believe it was in Jumpstart. I think that's the thing I see. This is 2 and a red for a 1/4 with Reach. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 1 damage to target creature an opponent controls. Only creatures.
This is another card where I think it would have to be proven to me first before I'm excited about putting it into a deck. Like, I feel like 1 damage is not going to deal with most things. I guess it does make combat a lot more challenging, but not to a degree that I am willing to take it highly unproven.
Yep, I agree. The 1/4 with Reach does enable you to be, again, like a big mid-range deck, which I'm happy to be here. Like, I want to be with the biggest mid-range deck at the table is like what I normally sit down to try and aim for in a Peasant Cube. And it's possible that the packs are open in such a way that I like end up drafting some, tempo deck or whatever that has happened. But my baseline goal is like big mid-range. I want big, powerful stuff. And this is just not powerful enough for me. So yeah, I'd rather start with something that has the potential to be very effective. All right, that's the pack. So for me, Soul Herder, Llanowar Wastes, Duskwatch Recruiter. Sounds like your number 1 is Recruiter. What else? What's your number 2 and 3 out of this pack?
Callous Dismissal still does really appeal to me, although
It does a lot of stuff.
I think in this particular context it might not be as good as I want to evaluate it. I definitely agree that Soul Herder is perhaps the most powerful card here, but I'm still too much of a coward to start with a gold card.
Respect. One question for you. Direct comparison, Callous Dismissal to Wall of Omens.
I mean, I'm just not as excited. I think Wall of Omens is honestly a little bit overrated. It doesn't really stop an aggressive board state as much as you want it to, because if your opponent has 3 1/1s, they can still just attack you for 2. So it's like, it's just not that exciting to me unless you can actually build around it and blink it. And obviously at that point it starts to become one of your critical pieces. But without that, it's just not that exciting to me.
Okay. I think I rate Wall of Omens higher in this environment and in general. I mean, the Dismissal gives you this tempo advantage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you get to bounce something, you get to make a little 1/1, which is almost certainly just going to chump block for you. Maybe you get to trade, potentially, but for the most part, that 1/1 is probably not doing a whole lot. So it's a bounce spell, it's a chump block, it's like buying you time. I think Wall of Omens has a very similar effect on the tempo of the game in that it really slows it down in your favor and replaces itself, which is big for me. So I have found Wall of Omens to be a very potent thing, a very potent defensive creature, just like basically a pacifism that scales up to be whatever the biggest thing your opponent has every time they attack is quite good, I think.
Interesting.
So,
okay.
That's my take, at least, but I don't actually know. Peasant is hard. I don't draft it that much, so I'd be curious for Allison to tell us what we did wrong. Allison, if you want to record a little voice memo or just write a note and tell us what we messed up, please do that, and we will correct it and read your comments on air, and you can take us to task. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, you should mail it to mail@luckypaper.co. Include your pronouns, include your name, how you want to be credited, include a brief description of what your cube's design goals are, and Anthony and I will consider doing a Pack 1 Pick 1 on the air of Lucky Paper Radio. I made a very silly spreadsheet.
Oh my god.
That's an evergreen statement. I can say that on most
Haven't
days
we
of the
done
week.
enough spreadsheets this week?
I love making. I am in the middle of numerous house projects. Our AC broke a couple weeks ago, which you know about. I have not told our listeners, so my wife and I are sharing the first floor of our house with an air mattress and both of our desks because the upper floors are uninhabitably hot. And
it was a bird collided with the AC. You might remember.
Yes, that was the catalyzing moment. That bird just blew everything up. No, so I have spreadsheets right now open for my various quotes from different HVAC contractors. I have a bunch of landscaping projects going on. I got a bunch of spreadsheets open for that. But you know what, Anthony? Those are not the fun spreadsheets. The fun spreadsheets are the ones that have nothing but magic cards in them. And I was talking earlier about how I am trying to break down my mono-white aggro deck and figure out how I'm supposed to build the main deck of it, given that I got so many of the cards that I wanted for the main deck and sideboard, that it's kind of hard to make those last couple cuts and figure out where my sort of playables should be. And to aid me in this, I made this spreadsheet, Anthony, and you've seen it. I'll describe it to the listeners. I will make sure I post this in some format on the show notes for the episode. So you can check the show notes out at luckypaper.co/podcast/8. This is probably episode 8, and you will see it there. Basically, I have a grid, and the columns there's a column for aggro, mid-range, and control, which are how I am currently modeling the different speeds of decks in my environment. And then I got rows here for positive, neutral, and negative. And what I'm attempting to do is basically take all the cards in my list that I've drafted and put them all into a category for each matchup for aggro, mid-range, and control, and whether they are positive, neutral, or negative. And what I mean by positive, neutral, and negative is relative to the card itself. So it's not necessarily that all of the cards that are positive against aggro are the ones I'm going to play against aggro, because it's possible that the worst card that's positive against aggro is better against aggro than other matchups, but still worse than a card that's just the same in all matchups. A good example is that a card like Chrome Mox is in neutral for all categories. That card is just always good. It doesn't matter who I'm playing against. And it's one of the best cards in my deck, so I'm obviously never going to cut that, even for a card that is, quote-unquote positive in a specific matchup. Effie, do you think about your cube like this?
I mean, we've talked a lot about how, specifically the very aggressive decks dictate a lot about the way the format plays out, but I have never made a spreadsheet like this.
Well, neither have I until very recently, but this is definitely the main mental model I have for additions and cuts to my own cube. I'm always thinking about how every card pairs up in specific matchups, and that's a change from where I originally started when I first built my cube, and from the mentality I see a lot of people approach their first cube with, which is very I see people evaluating cards based on the interactions with other cards in the same deck. Is a thing that pops up a lot, where it's I'm running this card, and it's really great if you combine it with these other cards. And good examples are all the Blink cards, right? People see a card like Soul Herder or Wall of Omens, and they're like, well, this card is great in the Blink deck because it interacts with all these other cards in the same colors, and it creates this cool value. And I just, instead of looking at Soul Herder and say, wow, this card is great for the Blink deck, I look at Soul Herder and say, how good is a 3-mana 1/1 against aggro? It's bad. How good is a 3-mana 1/1 against midrange? Well, actually, there it's probably pretty good, because midrange is probably not going to have that many ways to reach out and destroy the Soul Herder, and then I can start generating a bunch of value, which is the axis on which midrange hopes to win the game anyway. So I'm happy to have it there to kind of grind people out. How good is Soul Herder against control? And the answer in a cube with a lot of removal is probably quite poor, because it's 3 mana and is likely to just eat a removal spell. So that's how I think about all of the additions and cuts to my cube, and it definitely changes the way that I approach the design of my cube. Would you think you're more in that model, or are you in some other model, or how do you think about stuff? What's your mental model?
I mean, that's definitely a big part of it. I feel like there was a big shift for me, probably for a lot of Magic players, where you start out as, what's the psychographic? A Timmy, where you're just trying to assemble weird contraptions.
That's Johnny.
Johnny
likes to assemble weird contraptions. Out as a Johnny, Jenny.
Or Jenny.
Timmy just likes to cast Colossal Dreadmaw.
Well, I mean, everybody likes to cast Colossal Dreadmaw. And then you sort of upgrade to less looking at your own deck and, like you said, trying to figure out all these synergies, and instead trying to think about the metagame and what you're going to be playing against. And I definitely think about that in while I'm deck building, as well as while I'm trying to design the cube. A big part that influences is I love answerable answers, which I know not everybody's into, but to me, Oblivion Ring is so much more fun than just destroy target creature, because it gives you so much flexibility for the game to play out in different ways, and for your opponent to try and play around it in an interesting way.
Interesting. That's one I really don't like, personally. Now, answerable answers I think is fine. I really like soft answers in some way. So, for example, I love Mana Leak, because Mana Leak is a card that, can potentially be bad and can potentially be very good. And, if your opponent has it, you can theoretically begin to try and play around it. That one's, kind of hard to do so. I also really like like efficient but limited scope removal. So, just cheap burn spells, for example. Like I love them as removal spells because they can't kill giant stuff, but they can kill small stuff. Those kinds of things I do like. But the Oblivion Ring thing for me is like the ceiling is you paid 3 mana for like an Anguished Unmaking, basically. Like, just 2 and a white to remove something forever, and your opponent has no hope to interact with it, and it's like quite powerful. And the floor is really bad, which is you played 3 mana and in many cases didn't even cost your opponent a card because they just hit it with a Rex Sage or an Acidic Slime or something that was like, an incidental way to remove an artifact or enchantment, which are the best ways to remove them. And then your entire card is like negated and you kind of get blown out. I think the worst offender of all of these is Sower of Temptation, which a lot of people really like, but I played for a while and just it's like either you pay 4 mana and you get a control magic and a 2/2 flyer and your opponent is hopelessly destroyed, or more likely you pay 4 mana and then your opponent uses Shock and undoes your 4 mana play with 1 mana at a time where they get to ambush an attacker or something with the creature they get control of again, and it's just so swingy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a degree. I think I'm more tolerant of variance and of these sort of swingy kind of gameplay than you are. I think it leads to some of the most fun and exciting moments in Magic. But I definitely agree something like Sower is very much to the extreme, whereas something like Oblivion Ring is sort of like, okay, well, my opponent's played this. Can I figure out how long, I can continue to, get hit in the face by this flyer or whatever until I can actually set up a turn where I can get a 2-for-1 by removing it at the right moment, which to me is one of the very fun aspects of Magic. But I don't know how related that is to what you're saying. I think I would definitely like to go through my own environments and think about them more in this lens. Obviously, I think part of what you're saying is, as a player, you're trying to figure out what to sideboard against different matchups, and that's always a consideration. Like, I still have Allison's Cube up here, and this is such a clear example of an Angelic Ascension that gives you a huge token, but at the loss of 2 cards. And there are so many matchups where that's just going to be a horrible liability. So definitely as a player, I'm always thinking about what's going to work in different matchups, and while I'm drafting, you're thinking about what are the things you're planning on sideboarding in or out.
Yeah, it was a big driver of the order in which I picked cards in this rotisserie draft too. So, like, the order I picked cards does not at all, it barely lines up with what I think the, power level rankings for the cards that are most important for the deck. It doesn't really have, it's kind of correlated in some ways, but we talked before on the show about how both you and I prioritized all of the colorless cards, both the really, really powerful ones like, Copter and GT and stuff like that. But also the ones that are maybe a little bit less incredible. Like, I took Dismember very highly. I like Dismember a lot, but I don't think that's like the 6th best card in my deck, which is I took its 6th pick because it was a colorless card, obviously. I really prioritized making sure that I had key cards against each matchup early on because I didn't want to get to a point where I just was, late in the packs and didn't have any of my stuff to go against mid-range or didn't have any of my stuff to help me in the aggro mirror. I was heartbroken when another drafter took Elspeth Sun's Nemesis from me much earlier than I expected it to go. I think his Planeswalker is overall underrated, and I expected to be able to pick it up for myself kind of late, and that was going to be one of my key cards specifically against you. So once that was gone, I prioritized a couple of good anti-aggro cards relatively soon after because I wanted to make sure not to be caught without my anti-aggro cards. So my picks were not really dictated by the curve I wanted or anything like that. My picks were dictated by making sure that I was in my head, I didn't have this spreadsheet at the time, but in my head I was basically filling in, all 3 of the positive, cells for all the different matchups to make sure I had pieces for all those different games. Another example there is in some matchups, I don't really want much removal in my deck because, against control, they're not going to have many targets. I don't want to have dead cards in my hand. But I took removal kind of highly because I knew that other decks were going to be more, control decks that were playing white, would be more likely to take a removal spell than they would be to take, a cheap 1-mana creature or something. So I took those very highly and knew that I would get those 1-mana creatures late, which is a little bit, like I said earlier, all of these cards that are these enablers and payoffs for aggro decks, like your equipment and your vehicles and stuff, are only good if your deck is full of cheap creatures. So in some ways the cheap creatures are the most important cards in my entire deck, but they were also the least contentious, so I could wait till later to pick them up and feel confident they were going to still be around. So yeah, this kind of model kind of drives everything that how I think about my cube entirely, which something I'm conscious of is that I don't think this model is perfect. I have criticisms of binning all Magic decks into aggro or mid-range or control. I think it's an imperfect system and also kind of conflates things sometimes. But it's the best formalized model that I have right now. And it's interesting to me that the cards I choose to run in my cube and how I choose to draft decks is like very influenced by this flawed model. And I'm interested in the idea that like a new thought technology could come along and change how we think about decks and Magic cards and tempo, and thus, throw into new relief what kinds of cards would be better or worse in our cubes. And that's something I hope to like contribute to.
Well, that model seems to be like one framework that you can talk about decks and their overall strategy. But obviously, when you're playing the games, that is not something you can stick to. Sometimes you'll be a fairly controlling deck, but you just have an opportunistic start where you can get in a bunch of extra early damage. So, I mean, it's not the entire way you can think about the way all the games work.
Right, yeah. And I think one of the best things to keep in mind is that, your deck, you might consider it to be of a category based on how you drafted it. But like you said, depending on your opponent and your draw, like you might need to audible into being the controlling deck, even if you're, otherwise the aggressor. And in that vein, I think that highlights one of the huge advantages that mono red has. So, I mean, like making an honest evaluation of these decks we've been drafting for the past 3 weeks, I think yours is the better aggro deck, even though you did miss out on some Rabble Masters that we cut from you, these late picks, because red has this incredible advantage of being able to turn its burn spells, which are good against any matchup, because very oftentimes they just kill your opponent and end the game, into very efficient removal in the aggro mirror. So your deck has probably, conservatively like 7 to 10 free removal spells that you can main deck happily and not worry about being dead in your hand or something, that when you play against me specifically, you're just going to 1-for-1 all of my threats until I can kind of put something together, play a Planeswalker that has a high enough devotion, or maybe I can land a Mother of Runes or something early and get in under your first removal spell or something. I need to like get a little lucky, I think, to kind of change that. And in that matchup, you really become the control deck essentially, even though you are the most aggressive deck at the table by many means, because in that matchup, all you need to do is basically negate all my stuff and then win with your bigger threats eventually.
Interesting. I mean, isn't that still just a kind of tempo? If I'm, maybe I play a Goblin Guide and then burn your next 3 plays and I'm just getting in damage. I'm not necessarily getting ahead in terms of value, but I'm still able to get damage through at the expense of not really adding to my board for the next couple turns. That still seems like an aggressive strategy.
Oh, right. It depends on whether or not you have that turn 1 Goblin Guide.
Right.
In some games you might not. Some games you might just say, you know what, I've got Chandra and Stonecoil Serpent in my hand, and I'm just going to spend the entire first 5 turns of the game removing all of his threats, and then I'll play a big Planeswalker, and then I'll play a 6-drop, which I should have no right to even have in my aggro deck, but I've got the scalable card, which in this matchup becomes a huge finisher that, I just can't deal with. I noticed that you took, Glorybringer higher than I expected, and it's the kind of card that if I were drafting the mono red seat, I probably would not have ended up with it. I expect somebody else would have cut it for me before I picked it, but that's the kind of card that against me specifically is a huge problem.
That's exactly why I took it, and why maybe my whole strategy has collapsed, is that I was not necessarily thinking, I need to fill out these different spaces. I was just thinking, I will get all the red cards. I just need to stake my territory and take these things in the correct order so that, Allison, who might end up going into a blue-red deck, who might want these like couple of 5-drops and these split burn spells, and somebody else might want XYZ. You want the Stonecoil Serpents and so forth. So I was definitely just trying to draft defensively. I was not thinking about like filling out my deck in an even way, which I think in retrospect has been a mistake.
I think your deck is very good. I don't think you're gonna have a problem, like I said. But yeah, like that's a good example.
I don't know how to build it. If anyone out there knows how to build a mono red deck, tweet at me or whatever.
I know a few Discord channels you can post in and get quite a few opinions blasted your way. So yeah, I think that's one of the cool advantages of red aggro, is that the burn spells are so flexible that they allow you to more easily shift your role in the matchup depending on your draw, depending on your opponent, depending on all sorts of factors, where the white aggro deck has, I think, pound for pound better threats. The creatures are better. I can do unfair stuff like, play Mothers of Runes and whatnot. I get more like natural card advantage in white with stuff like the Ranger Captain of Eos and the Stoneforge Mystic. Like those things are just kind of value, which helps me in like other matchups. But I don't have as much flexibility in terms of just changing what my cards do based on the matchup. I kind of, a little bit more linear than the burn spells are. So yeah, anyway, I don't think that this is like a perfect model, but frankly, given how much I think about my cube this way, I thought it would be much easier for me to categorize these cards in these different cells, but I found it to be very difficult. Did you have a chance to look at this at all? Do you have anything that jumps out at you as like wildly wrong, or you don't understand why I categorize it in a certain way?
So it was a little bit difficult, honestly, to look at it without this context. Like, I was just looking at this list of cards, and there's just so much more context that it is important. And the context that it is here is just like, this is a specific deck that you're trying to build against a specific field of other decks.
Right.
So nothing really jumped out to me other than it was just a little bit difficult to parse.
It is a lot. I kind of want to walk through this a little bit, though, and just like talk through it, both
Right,
for
give
myself.
me some highlights.
But for myself, partially because I think talking through it, I'll like realize things that I did not realize by typing it out, and then also like maybe it gives you an opportunity to like question some of the decisions I've made here. So I actually want to start with the cards. So all these ones I have marked with blue here, Anthony. These are all cards that are just neutral in all matchups. So these are the cards that I don't think have any substantial variance depending on the matchup, and I would expect. I should say, too, this is 39 cards here. I'm obviously not going to be playing 11 lands in this deck, so I have to make a few cuts no matter what. So it's possible that I'm not sure what the main deck configuration is yet. All this basically tells me, again, is like what I think these cards do relative to each matchup, not whether or not they're one of the best cards in the pool. So, for example, I might end up just deciding that like one card is just the worst card in this pool. Let's say Adorned Pouncer, which I'm pretty certain I'm going to be cutting. Even though Adorned Pouncer is, I think, quite good in some matchups, probably just going to get cut for being bad overall. Anyway, these are the cards in my pool that I think are the same in every matchup. So we have Chrome Mox, always great. Sunbaked Canyon and Silent Clearing, which are the two Horizon lands that have white in them. You could argue these are maybe a little negative in aggro, but frankly, I don't think the damage is going to be that bad. Maybe I'll end up cutting those in aggro. Maybe they are negative in aggro, but that's up for discussion. Student of Warfare, Figure of Destiny, the two scaling 1-drops, Mother of Runes, Giver of Runes. I think those are all cards that are just good in every matchup in different ways, but like I don't think they vary that much. I have Kythian in here too, Kythian, Hero of Akros, and Stoneforge Mystic as the cards that just kind of neutral across the board. I couldn't really poke too many holes where in specific matchups these cards got worse or better. So the scalable 1-drops, like there's no other 1-drops here except for the two scalable ones, the two Mother of Rune variants, and Kythian. The other 1-drops in my deck, which there are many, I think do vary matchup to matchup. The cool thing about the scalable ones is that obviously you get to decide when to scale them. And for example, against a control deck, I'm much more likely to spend some mana scaling these cards early, because what I think it can do is force a Wrath with very few cards invested on my part. Obviously, it's not as good against target removal, but that's a risk I have to take. And I think playing a Student of Warfare on 1 and then just leveling and swinging and forcing your control opponent to answer it before you commit more things to the board is good when you know your opponent has board wipes. Against something like aggro, probably not going to spend any time leveling it up, because the tempo loss of losing that creature at an opportune moment and then eating 6 damage or something is too risky. I'd rather just probably run out more cheap threats with that mana just to kind of flood the board, trade off 1 for 1, and try and get one of my like key cards going before I would do that. So the flexibility there, I think, makes them good in every matchup. Same with Mother of Runes, Giver of Runes. They do different things depending on the matchup. Against aggro, they just block well. They can give themselves protection and block all day. Against mid-range, they give things unblockable and help like, poke through that last damage. And then against control, obviously, like fizzling and blanking removal spells is pretty key. So they do different things in every matchup, but it's all very relevant. Kythian stands out to me, though, because he's just, 1-mana 2/1. But his abilities, I think, make him good in each matchup. So he's not good or bad in aggro. He's just a 2/1. He's fine. He'll trade off with stuff. It's whatever. Against mid-range, I think he's still neutral, because even though he's a 2/1, which are usually bad against mid-range, because mid-range has bigger threats and your 2/1 is more quickly just invalidated, virtually by a 3 toughness blocker or whatever, he does have that mana sink to give himself indestructible and could potentially flip into a planeswalker, which is great in the mid-range matchup. And then I think I'm going to move him to being positive versus control, because I think he actually is up there. So maybe he's going to come out of this category as I'm talking through it. Does any of that not make sense?
I think it does. I think some of the other interesting things I'm noticing, like maybe like the obvious thing is Adanto Vanguard starts out pretty bad against aggro when you don't really want to be spending a ton of life just to kill some cheap creatures. But against control, actually tilting your deck into a more aggressive deck makes a lot of sense, and is obviously very, very hard to remove by most control decks. Another interesting thing I see is like you have Gideon Blackblade pretty good against aggro, gets worse against mid-range, which sort of makes sense that your opponent is not necessarily just going to be racing you and trying to attack your life total. They're actually going to, take the time, try and knock out your planeswalker, and have the creatures that are actually going to be able to do that. But then against control, it gets more valuable again, because they might not have a way to remove it, and it just becomes an incredibly powerful beater.
Right. I was talked into putting all the planeswalkers as positive against control. I was convinced that Elspeth and Gideon were good against control because you can get in under counter magic and then have a thing that's very difficult to deal with for your control opponent, who has usually a myriad of ways to kill creatures, but maybe more trouble with planeswalkers. I originally had Bosri who's in this pool, as actually negative against control, and got talked out of that by some people in the Discord. Basically, it was actually Minor Bug, who drafted his cube last week, talked me out of it just because my reasoning was that Bosri was so bad on an empty board because none of the abilities do anything. So you're just sitting there with essentially a dead card. But Bug's point, which I think is a very good one, is that the ultimate is a threat, and if you get to play a thing and just tick up 4 times and then down tick, you just get to win the game. So I actually moved it to positive, even though it's the kind of planeswalker that requires a board presence to do anything. And I was thinking about Gideon Blackblade right before we sat down to record, because I half inclined to put it in positive against mid-range too, which makes it positive against all the matchups, which means I just put it back down to neutral, because it does bolster your threats and makes them, I think, more... The thing about it is that he himself is a good threat, obviously, as an indestructible 4/4 that can attack. The fact that he can't block, I think, is why I still have him negative against mid-range, because he's not actually making your stuff brawl better against... He doesn't give power and toughness boosts, he just gives keyword abilities, which are cool and all, but if your creatures are all smaller, the keyword abilities are not that relevant. And then, like you said, he can just be attacked by your opponent's more potent threats, and therefore it looks a little bit less good there. So that's one. The kind of the summary of where these cards ended up. I went through all the cards that are neutral in all of the matchups. Basically, versus aggro, the stuff that I think is good is the stuff that gains life, stuff with first strike, and the stuff with bigger bodies. So bigger bodies is Brimaz and Ranger Captain of Eos, stuff with first strike like Double Thalias. I have a Dorn Pouncer in there. I think that's maybe a little suspect because it's a 2-drop with 1 toughness that can die to half of a Forked Bolt. And then, stuff that gives lifelink, obviously, I think is very good against aggro. Stuff weak against aggro, I have all the stuff that costs life or is bad to block or is a tempo liability. So Dismember, Adanto Vanguard just cost me life, probably not worth... Dismember is turning your threat into I lose 4 life and discard a card, and there's not much in your deck you'd be so unhappy turning into that spell for whatever it costs in your aggro deck. So that's why Dismember kind of falls off there. Vanguard...
Right. I mean, and against an aggressive deck, just playing a 3/3 will negate their largest creature just as well.
Right, exactly. I'd much rather have any of my creatures than a Dismember against you, because your threats are not going to be huge. Danto Vanguard just does not block well. You're not going to attack with that many 4 power things. It's more going to be a lot of 2 and 3 power things, maybe 1 power things. So a 1/1 that pays 4 life to block something, look real bad. And then the tempo stuff here. So think stuff like Heirloom Blade, even Smuggler's Copter I have here as negative against you, just because if my turn 1 play is some dork, some aggro creature, my turn 2 plays a Smuggler's Copter, and then I go to crew the copter and block, then I just get so blown out by a lightning bolt or something that it blocks. It gets rid of my block for the turn. It gets rid of my creature. It just risking essentially 2 cards on that equipment is rough. And then with the amount of burn spells you have, I think it's also possible in certain draws I could just have a copter and nothing to crew it with, and that risk is so potent against you that I think it actually becomes negative. This is a good example where I think it's negative, but it's probably still better than most of the other cards in my deck. Even though it's worse in this matchup, it's probably still going to make my deck even after sideboarding against you, even though I think it's worse here. Heirloom Blade, similar story. If I go to equip that and you just destroy the thing in response with a burn spell, then I spent 4 mana to do nothing, and that tempo loss is going to be huge against you. It's going to cost me 6, 7, or 8 life or something. So those cards are all kind of getting the cut. Same with Bosri too. I think Bosri is bad against you because of the whole fact that you can just deprive me of threats, and unlike the control deck where I'm happy to just uptick a planeswalker with no effect on the board to eventually threaten an alt, I will die before I get to ult it against you. So that needs to be sort of checking those boxes. Does that seem sensible for against you in this particular draft?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think Heirloom Blade is this like really good example of a pretty efficient card, but it does take a big tempo loss to actually be able to play and equip it. And if you're not able to actually like use that extra value that you get out of it to stabilize, then it's just going to do much less than it looks like.
I was thinking about this the other day because we've talked a little bit about Baneslayers and Mull Drifters on this podcast, and it's a topic of much discussion in the Cube community. And even though I have expressed my desire to move away from Baneslayer-related play, where the sort of decision is play some big creature that has a lot of value if it sticks around, and basically the game then kind of hinges on whether or not my opponent has removal, or whether or not I can answer that removal, and it becomes about that sort of game, which a lot of people like for the sort of tension it creates. For me, stuff like equipment and vehicles is what that is for me. Like, it's a similar thing where equipment can do nothing, the same way your Baneslayer Angel can do nothing if it eats a Doomblade. It has a really high ceiling. If you get to equip it and your opponent doesn't have interaction, it completely changes the board and the landscape of the game. The thing about the equipment that's great for me, though, is that you get a couple of bites at the apple, right? It's not just the one time you cast a creature, and if they have the one removal spell, it's over. It's like, you get to decide, am I going to go for the equip now? Am I going to spend my mana on other creatures now and go for the equip later? And then you can go for multiple equips, obviously, and just kind of like take multiple shots at assembling this like powerful creature. But I think it's a similar kind of tension that people like from playing quote-unquote Baneslayers.
Yeah, I like that take.
All right, so my take on the mid-range matchup here. A lot of stuff I have here is positive against mid-range. So the main things are evasion. My sort of take on the mid-range matchup is that I still expect to be ahead in the beginning, given that my deck is very aggressive and full of lots of 1-drops, and those 1-drops are good at attacking. But unlike against control, I don't expect in the mid-range matchup that I could really ever finish out a game before my opponent stabilizes. Like, I'm not going to get them dead before they have quote-unquote turned the corner. So I place a lot of value on stuff that gives me reach. And in my deck, that stuff is Elspeth Knight Errant, to give stuff flying specifically, the jump ability, Sky Mitre Aspirant, which also has flying, Selfless Spirit, again, flying. All these things also carry equipment very well. Smuggler's Copter, flying. That kind of reach is stuff I sort of rate very highly here. I also have all of the creature interaction as positive against mid-range, where not only will there be a lot of creatures, but they will really matter. A lot of my removal is actually pretty bad against you. We talked about Dismember is not very good against you. I have Path to Exile as neutral against aggro. I don't want to be like pathing a thing on turn 1 or 2 because ramping you is going to be quite bad for me. But there are certainly game states where I'll have to make that trade-off, I think. But pathing something on turn 5 or 6 from the mid-range deck, the ramp is much less relevant, and you also got to pay 1 mana and get rid of a really serious threat like a big 5/6 drop or something. Whereas against you, I'm gonna path a 2-drop or something. It seems bad. So all removal gets better, and then that's kind of it. Basically, the removal and the reach are the things that I think are much better against mid range. 2 little cards that kind of fit in there. I think Inspiring Sovereign and Thalia Heretic Cathar are at their best against mid range, where you are specifically almost always trying to stabilize with creatures, and both of those creatures basically set your stabilization back a whole turn, which can make a big difference. And then bad stuff against mid-range, actually not that much. I have the cheap creatures that have no other relevant abilities as bad against mid-range. So like Dauntless Bodyguard, I think is kind of negative against mid-range. It can't really attack very much as a 2/1. I have Isamaru also is bad against mid-range. I mean, a 1-mana 2/2 is a good rate, but when there's so many X3s that can just block it, it's not doing a whole lot. I'd much rather have, the ones that do stuff like Giant Killer or Sky Marcher Aspirant, which gets flying eventually, that kind of stuff. And then actually Thalia is, I think, pretty bad against the mid-range matchup, which is, one of the most important cards for the White Weenie deck, rated very highly. First Strike is obviously good, but it's not going to tax the most important stuff from the mid-range deck, and a 2/1, even with First Strike, is not going to brawl for that long profitably. Can you find any holes there?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe Lurrus seems pretty strong in this matchup, where I think value and giving you reach through like recasting a flyer repeatedly could be powerful. But maybe Lurrus is just great in every matchup.
Yeah, Lurrus is what I don't quite know how to rate. I think he's obviously good against aggro because of the lifelink, I think. That said, he also is a 3-drop that dies to most removal with only 2 toughness, so maybe I'm actually overrating him there a little bit, and just, getting lifelink blindness and assuming anything with lifelink must be good against aggro, but maybe it's not the case. yeah, I could definitely see we were right. Like, if we get to that stage of the game that I mentioned where I've done a lot of damage, but my mid-range opponent has essentially stabilized, and now I have to figure out how to get that last damage through, continually recurring a Selfless Spirit could be the way to do it. Just keep bringing it back and, putting an Heirloom Blade on it and smashing. And then, unlike the aggro matchup, I also have some of that stuff that augments the creatures as positive here. So I think Heirloom Blade and Smuggler's Copter specifically are at their best here because the mid-range deck usually in my cube has less ways to proactively remove stuff. You're removing stuff virtually by just having bigger blockers, where instead of playing Doomblades and Disfigures to kill your opponent's threats, you're just going to play a Courser of Crewfix, and now all their stuff looks silly and can't attack. And so these cards get better because you're less likely to suffer a tempo loss from your thing getting removed in response to you, crewing or equipping. And then they also help offset the way in which your opponent tried to stabilize. Giving a 3 power boost to any of my creatures means they're going to trade for pretty much anything a mid-range deck can block with, and then I'm happy to trade and keep churning through my deck and getting damage through. So they're really shining here, I think. I don't want to just talk. Do you have any other thoughts? I feel like I'm just monopolizing the pod.
No, you got it. Monop the pod.
All right, and then the control matchup. So notable here, I have all of the lands as positive. So I have Mutavault, Rashadan Port, and Strip Mine, which are all neutral in the other matchups, and I have them as positive here, mostly because they're either destructive to mana, which is especially good when you're trying to keep your opponent off of a big stabilizing play like a Wrath, and then Mutavault is also great for surviving that Wrath. Your opponent, Wraths, or they play a Planeswalker and down tick to remove your creature or something, and then you can animate a Mutavault and get in there and sort of get it off the board. So the lands are all great against control. Planeswalkers are all great against control, and then the hard-to-kill stuff, Seasoned Howlblade, Adanto Vanguard, also great against control, Dauntless Bodyguard, all go up. So it'll be interesting the really cheap creatures. So the stuff that was worst against mid-range is pretty much all favored against control, because now those really cheap creatures, which were otherwise negated by 3 toughest blockers, the control deck doesn't usually have that. Instead, they're leaning on a board wipe or something. And so what you really want to maximize is just getting early damage through as fast as possible. And the cheap creatures do that. Conversely, the stuff that gets worse, creature removal gets worse across the board. And I actually also here have Brimaz as negative against control, just because it's a Baneslayer. It's a 3-drop that just dies to removal if you don't get to attack with it. And most of the removal that kills, something like a Brimaz is cheaper than 3 mana. And so you're going to take a tempo hit when you cast it. So that's how I'm kind of imagining that matchup. And I don't know how right I am on any of this stuff. Some of it feels right, and then a lot of it I have a lot of questions. Like you mentioned Luris. I don't really know where Luris stacks up against all of these. Similar with like Ranger Captain of Eos. Like Ranger Captain of Eos I have as positive against aggro, neutral against mid-range and control, but against mid-range and control, it generates card advantage for the white deck in both of those matchups, which seems like an important tool to like not fall too far behind the decks that are otherwise trying to outvalue you. So it was a hard challenge, especially considering this is how I always contextualizing my cube in my head. And but I think it was productive to do. I feel like I have a better understanding of how I want it. What at least I think my understanding of the main deck configuration should be, having like made this weird spreadsheet.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something else that stands out to me is that the context is really key. So I think in some cubes where the way that a control deck wins is by, playing some big creature that's their finisher. You definitely would want, your Path to Exiles and other cheap removal spells high up in your list against a control deck.
Right.
But I think in this case, they're more about, casting Upheaval or a powerful Planeswalker, so they don't actually interact with that matchup very much.
Yeah, it's definitely very specific matchup dependent. And maybe if I have too much free time this weekend, I'll actually look at all 7 other decks that we've drafted in the RotoCube and do a very similar. I'll basically like put together sideboard plans for each deck and see how I think those decks match up ahead of time, just to again like get my head around what I think the main deck configuration should be. Because I can imagine a world where like I put together what I think is the main deck, and then I go across all the matchups and do the sideboards for all of them and figure out like actually I'm siding this in 6 out of 7 times. So this maybe should be a main deck card, even though it feels like in some ways it's a sideboard card, but actually against these exact decks I'm playing, it's better more than it's not. So that's a consideration.
Wow. I definitely admire your dedication to spend a lot of time on one specific Magic experience. Like you and a couple other friends are definitely willing to do that. For me, I'm much more just like, you know what, let's just have fun, let's get some reps in and hopefully develop more of an intuition about this than as much like analyzing and trying to maximize your win percentage in every single event. But Magic is different things to different people.
Yeah, we haven't the thing I've been thinking about a lot is I think at some point we need to do a podcast and an article about like getting into Cube. I've had a couple friends that, thanks to quarantine, have gotten into Cube specifically, or like returned to Magic for the first time in a while, and then asked me about designing a Cube or whatever. And I think it's a good resource for us to tackle at some point. And it strikes me that, my advice for people that are looking to start a Cube has always been, since the beginning of my experience with Cube, just like walk away from the Discord channels and the subreddits and the podcasts and just go put cards that you like together and draft them. Because if you spend a lot of time doing this, we spend a lot of time talking about little tiny edges, and a lot of people will like just litigate the best red 3-drops for months and months and months on all these various discussion channels and figuring out which Rabble Masters are the best Rabble Masters. And it's like those edges are completely irrelevant to somebody who is just starting this format and just wants to like see what it's like. And it's fun that people that are really invested get to like go super deep on it, and we get to have these conversations. But I think for somebody that's like new to the format, it can be very overwhelming. So my advice has always been just play Magic. Drafting is fun. It does not matter if your cube is unbalanced. It does not matter if the colors don't match in numbers. It does not matter if you have cards that are wildly overpowered or underpowered. Just draft it and have fun, and you'll learn from there. But
I think the really important part of that is that the like analyzing those little edges is extremely valuable for somebody who wants to get really invested in cube design. If you just want to play cube, that doesn't matter. Like, you just look at what the cards are in the cube you're playing and figure out what's powerful. You're not you're not making the same kinds of comparisons. So I think that can be very intimidating, but the important thing is that doesn't have to be important to you. If you don't find that part fun, cube can still be for you.
Right. And the realization I've had recently, which is a slight caveat to what has always been my, like, just perennial advice for people that are trying to get into Cube, is that I've realized that I think there are more people than I originally at first appreciated. And I'm close to amongst this category. Like, we get to play our cubes quite a lot. And from talking to people on the Discord and other communities, like, I think we're a blessed play group. Not everyone has, enough friends that are willing to play cube. They can get together on a regular basis, and so we get to play our cubes more than most people. But even if we didn't, and there was definitely times in the life of my cube where I wasn't playing it very much at all, there's a group of people that just want to design a cube for the design challenge, and actually playing it is not as important to them. And I think there's a good chance that group of people is like a chunk of our audience that maybe doesn't get to play the cube as much as they want, but they just the joy of putting together an environment and curating this experience, even if they don't get to experience it so often, is still fun. And so, this like spreadsheet thing I'm doing here, like, how much does this actually increase my win percentage? Probably none. Maybe 0.1%. But this is like the part of my brain that is one of the reasons I really like Cube, is that this is an excuse for me to make some spreadsheets and to like, I am so interested in systems and how all of these like components interact with one another that like trying to come up with a taxonomy to categorize them and put them in some sort of order so I can better understand them is like a fascinating challenge for me. So like, I don't think this is good practice. Like, if you were trying to practice for a pro tour or something, I wouldn't say make this spreadsheet for all of your matchups in like the meta of whatever constructed format you're playing.
Are you telling people how to play the pro tour?
I'm not. I explicitly am not. That's what I said. I'm not doing it.
You said not. Okay.
But yeah, for me, this is fun for a completely different, like, just very superficial reason, that it's just like fun to try and come up with a taxonomy for it. And I think it's a very different motivation than just trying to play better or be a better Magic player. And that's part of what I want to like address on the show and address about cube design, because I think it's what a lot of people are in it for. You're in it for like a new perspective on the game and trying to understand it in different ways. That's what this spreadsheet is trying to do for me. I'm just trying to get a better grasp on how I consider these cards in different matchups.
It's like building a commander deck where you get to dig really deep into all the like most esoteric cards that could be perfectly powerful in whatever context. It's like building like a commander deck times 10. It's so many more cards, and the ways that they interact is so much more complex. More than 10, because you're not playing the same deck every time.
Right. The amount of variability is truly staggering. We talked last episode about how important like the singleton thing is to us for intentionally increasing that variability, and that's because of that, because you get so much more, range of experience out of the cards you've collected. I'll actually say that like I loved Commander largely for the deck building. Even in like the peak of our Commander years, the gameplay was never my favorite part, because it can be very very just drawn out and kind of painful, frankly, to be involved in Commander games. It's also so hard to find a play group where the decks are evenly matched and you get like dynamic games and there's not some weird power level disparity. But building Commander decks is so fun for me because I love finding all those little connections. And that was how I started my cube, where I was, again, thinking in that different way about like, how do all these cards combine with each other to make a cool deck? And that was one kind of thinking which I very much inherited from Commander, because in Commander, the card pool is so varied and the number of viable commanders is so broad that there isn't a meta in casual Commander. There's a meta in competitive Commander because there's only a few viable, decks or whatever. But if you're playing like your LGS, like you might know the players that are often around in the kind of decks they have, but for the most part, you have no idea what you're playing against. So you really only have to fall back on, all right, how do I make a little machine, a little 100-card machine that does something powerful and cool that I can like put in different contexts and have it do its thing. And when I started working on my cube, it's what I was doing. I was basically trying to include pieces where it was like, oh, if you get this card and this card, you combine them together, you make this cool new effect. And what I felt like I was doing is I was depriving my decks of cards that could meaningfully interact with other strategies, because so many of the cards that are cool internally cool to your own deck are just kind of a wash against different kinds of strategies. Like it's just like they don't affect your matchup against different decks. They just are a thing you hope you get to do, and if you get to do it, it's good, and if you don't, it's bad. And so my like changing of thinking about it to be like strictly about the matchups, like every card I cut or add, I'm thinking about, how does it pair up in all these different matchups across the cube? And there's heuristics to help us, right? Like the reason I like cheap cards so much is because, frankly, expensive cards tend to be very bad against aggro because you oftentimes don't get to cast them and you just die. So any card that costs more than 4 mana, as we put through the lens of this is already bad against aggro, kind of as a matter of course. So is it good enough in every other context to justify the fact that it's so bad in a third of the matchups in the cube? Those kinds of things dictate all of my picks now. And it really changes the way I think about the game. I also used to feel like I had more of an identity, like a kind of player I was back when I was playing EDH. Like I like to build certain kinds of decks, and I had specific things about Magic that I liked. And I feel like curating a cube and thinking about the cube in this way has made me much more open to like, I don't think of myself as a control player or an aggro player or a mid-range player or having any color preferences or alliances. I just think of myself as like being able to see and appreciate many different aspects of the game because I'm forced to include them in my cube in this way. So anyway, we should definitely do our Commander episode some point to get more into this, because I think there are so many interesting overlaps with Commander and Cube. But the big difference for me is that I found that approaching my Cube like a big Commander deck was not leading to the kind of gameplay that I liked. It was leading to this kind of solitaire style gameplay where everyone was just trying to do their own thing. And if they interacted with their opponent, great. And if they didn't, whatever. I want everyone to be constantly worried about what their opponents are doing, even more so than what they themselves are doing.
Right. I mean, I don't think that's totally fair, though. Like, I think that Cube and Commander have a ton in common, just in terms of like the way that you're building the actual list of cards, the way you get to collect it, the way it gets to be a reflection of the kinds of things you're interested in. The thing that is different is that if you're playing 2-player games, people are going to try and optimize it, and if you can't just say, well, here's my collection of small interesting machines, because people are going to try and optimize it in a way that you might not expect, and you might have your heart broken if they just say, well, actually, I'm going to ignore all those little machines you laid out and just build something else that is totally unexpected and maybe doesn't even play into the style that you're interested in. But I think that's not less. I think that's actually just, you have to build this like meta machine that supports what you're interested in, but you have to build a thing that encourages your players to find that fun part. And I think that if you're interested in that kind of gameplay, you can still build a cube that reflects that like the way to optimize it is to be able to do those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And this is similar to what we were talking about last week, which I actually thought about this a lot more after I edited the episode, and I talked about it on Twitter a little bit. I feel like part of what we were getting at last week when we were talking about why Singleton is important to us and like why I don't run functional duplicates and why I include cards that like I think are worse than other cards I could include, but I leave them in there for, variety, basically. I feel like there's a big distinction in the Cube community between Cube designers that think they know the optimal way to draft their own cube. They think that, like, here's the pick order, here are the viable decks, and if you're doing something else, then it's not going to work because, I've designed the environment, I know what's up. Versus Cube designers who don't think they know the most viable strategy. And I count myself amongst the latter group, and I hope I never I hope I never find myself in the former group where I think I know how to like quote unquote solve my cube, or like what's viable and not viable. Because to me, so much of the joy of Cube comes from what you just talked about, the idea that like you design an environment, but ultimately you are subjecting other players to it who are going to bring their own values to the game and their own card evaluations, their own biases, their own predilections. And between that combination of what you've created in the cube and what they've drafted and played is going to be this new thing. Like you like have a little brain baby together, and it's like it's a way to talk about the mechanics of the game and theory about the game in very literal, practical terms. Like a draft pick is like saying something about what you think about the game and how the environment works, and like the first line of a conversation that you get to have with your players. And that's why I love collecting up with deck lists from people when they draft my cubes and just seeing what they've done and talking about why they played this card in the sideboard instead of in the main, because that to me is like all the fun of the environment, is providing room for that to happen. And if it was just that we got to the end of a draft and I informed you, sorry, you drafted suboptimally, you should have taken this lightning strike here instead of this abrade, then that's a soulless environment to me.
Yeah, I mean, just like regular standard formats that are designed by wizards, sometimes people will complain, oh, well, it's just, the format's not quite balanced. They should have thought about A, B, and C and how it affected these formats. But it wouldn't be fun if wizards produced a solved game and there was such an easy solution that their small team of people could figure it out. Like, the fun part about Magic is that it's always a new and interesting challenge that takes a tremendous amount of effort to figure out how to do optimally, or even close to optimally.
It's something I think about a lot. I agree with you that I think I've always thought that the sort of pretense of the play design team, depending on how you like look at it, some people consider the play design team's job to be to like make sure that standard isn't broken or whatever. To me, I don't think that job, I think it's a job that any small team is bound to fail. Like, I don't think a small team of people is going to be able to fully test a whole meta the same way that hundreds of thousands of competitive Magic players, all at once on social media, kind of trying to break something, are going to be able to bring some attention to. And I agree that I think as Magic exists, it's very interesting because it changes constantly. But I don't know that that's fundamental to the game being interesting. So, like, the whole point of a meta is that theoretically you should be able to have, a diverse meta with lots of viable strategies that are always constantly ebbing and flowing, and like none is dominated by another. And I think about this a lot in regards to video games, because I don't actually play any competitive video games, but I'm like a weird fan of video game communities. And I know that stuff like StarCraft and League of Legends and all these games, like, they have metas, and the metas are notoriously like incredibly balanced because these games are always being tweaked and adjusted in development. They're not like Magic cards where they get printed and then they exist forever, except in rare circumstances, companions, where they had to change how they work. Magic cards just go out the door, and if there's a powerful card, oops, there's a powerful card. But in these video games, they're always releasing patches and increasing the damage of some spell by 0.2% and decreasing the range of some attack by some other small percentage to like get everything perfectly balanced. And I read a sort of I think it was a Quora answer once that was describing just how balanced StarCraft was, and like how much more wildly balanced it was than any other like tangible game. People think of like a game like chess as being very balanced, except that turns out going first is a huge advantage. So it's actually a lot of variance in chess, even though it's a completely public information game with a exactly equal starting state. Someone
it's
has
also
to go first.
Symmetrical, so of course it's balanced aside from whoever goes first. The cool thing about StarCraft is it is asymmetrical but still balanced.
Right, asymmetrical and extraordinarily balanced. I think I don't see any reason in theory why it wouldn't be possible if Magic were to turn all of its resources away from making just a bunch of new cards and away from releasing 4 sets a year, and just say, we are going to either focus on an existing format like Pioneer or Historic or whatever, or Modern, or just design a brand new standard format. Say we're starting here from ground one. I think it's possible they could make like a idealized constructed format where it was perfectly balanced, the meta was diverse, people could play lots of different strategies viably without having them be dominated by other strategies. It's just that that's not what Magic is. Like, that strategy does not sell a bunch more packs. It doesn't keep Hasbro sort of running and churning as a business. It's just it's not the thing that Magic is, and so it's hard to wish for it to be that.
Would that even appeal to you?
No.
I know you're a heavy constructed player.
No, it would not appeal to me. Not only because I don't care about constructed, but because I like Magic for the novelty. I like the fact that there are new cards all the time. because it gives me more world to play in. I like Magic as a playground, not as a highly tuned competitive game, even though I do try and get better at it.
Right. I think that's one of the key things that, like, we are not interested in just approaching a constructed format and saying, hey, here's the 6 decks, or, even if it was up to 40 decks, to say you can pick the one depending on the week, one will be better than the other, and have a good time. I'm sure that's fun, but that's just not for me. For me, like that ideal,
I don't play StarCraft.
That ideal of having that like moment of discovery of wow, here's this broken card that combos with this other card that no one else has discovered yet, is such a beautiful thing to strive for, even though in constructed and like standard that's going to happen so rarely, unless you're one of these really top people. But
right, you could be someone that invents Lantern Control for the first time, but
right.
Like the thing that's exciting about Cube for me is that it's not even just like, oh, I didn't know you could combine these 2 cards and do some combo. I think at this point I know all of the combos you can do in my cube. I know how all the cards interact with each other. The interesting thing for me is every board state is like, the chances you ever come across the same board state and the same decision in a game of Cube are like probably 1 in a gazillion. Like where your hands are the same, the board is the same, and you have to decide what to do with the sort of available options to you. It's just a never-ending stream of new decisions that are influenced by the context you're in. Whereas, I know from talking to players that play Constructed, it's like you just have these heuristics. If you're playing against this matchup, all that matters is that you don't let them do X, or that you kill this thing before this happens, or that you don't let them assemble Tron, or whatever. There's always some key to every matchup, and the games become about just kind of wrestling to get to that important decision point, that inflection point, and make it in your favor. Where Cube, it's like every day is a new decision, which I think is the beauty of it.
And I think that sort of nugget of novelty is really the part that's most successful about Commander and Cube, where the fact that you can get some new legendary creature and say, oh wow, now this whole set of cards that would just do absolutely nothing in most other contexts now become extremely powerful and worth considering to put into my deck. And it's the same when you're building a cube. You're putting all these cards into a new context where it's a whole, even though you're not printing new cards, it's still an entirely new problem to solve, and all these different new novel decisions in drafting and playing to explore what they actually can do.
That is one of the most brilliant things about Commander, is that it does one thing that so many players want to do, is play cards they just want to play. And Commander is the kind of format where almost any card you want to make viable, you can do it. You can find a card that you want to play and find a commander that works for it and kind of build a deck to make that card work. And that is one of the most thrilling things about that format. One of the first decks I built for Commander was my stupid Skeleton Ship deck. My Skeleton Ship -1/-1 proliferate deck, because I thought Skeleton Ship was a silly, goofy card. It's quite bad, but the deck was fine. It could hang at our casual tables because you have the whole history of Magic at your fingertips, and you get to kind of be like an archaeologist and just digging for the pieces to like put together this cool machine. That's really like such an incredible successful thing about Commander. And Cube for me is like the same, even more so. There's no banned cards. There's a bigger card pool available to you. There's like plenty of space to do customs, and you're not playing it against other people outside of your own meta, so there's no room for people to tell you can't do what you want to do. But also the potential combinations are just orders of magnitude more varied. Like there's probably 2 billion Commander decks you could make, feasibly in a certain way, possibly. And if there's 2 billion of those, then there's like just trillions of Cube decks that could possibly be built from different Cube environments because of all the different contexts that you can change with the cards you choose.
And don't tweet at Andy for just doing some bad math right there. It's not important.
I didn't do any math. I just said the word billion and then trillion because those were a big number and a bigger number. I'm sure the numbers are actually much bigger than that, but I'm not going to sit here and say like septillion or,
No, you sound like a dork.
This is something I confessed to you before, Anthony, but I'll confess it to our listeners now. When I was a child, I learned about math, and I learned about numbers, and my teachers told me numbers go on to infinity. And so I had the obvious conclusion. I was like, well, and this is me like, maybe 3rd or 4th grade. They were like, numbers go on to infinity, they never end. And I was like, okay, well, if numbers go on to infinity, that means that any sound or word I make out of my mouth has to be a number. And so I would just make up numbers and say like, that number is like squapoople-doople, and that's the biggest number, and it's bigger than kling-clock or whatever. And my teachers were concerned about me.
I mean, I think that's a very interesting revelation. I thought you were going to instead share the giant
You're being very generous.
Mural
that's not what you
of
said
a
last time I told you this.
Colossus that you had painted on your wall.
I did have a giant Bloodfire Colossus painted on my wall. That was peak Andy back in the day. Loved the art on that card. Loved an excuse to paint on my wall. My parents were all too supportive, and so I had that going for me. Painted it myself in elementary school probably. Anyway, I think we should end the episode there, Anthony. I want to end, though. I have a question for you. I'm going to press you a little bit. I have a card here that has been in and out of my cube a couple times, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. I'm putting you on the spot. You do not know what this card is, but Anthony, what do you think about Explore?
Explore. I love Explore. I love cantrips. I love playing extra lands. It does play out a little bit worse often than I want it to. I think the most obvious comparison is to Rampant Growth, and as much as they look similar, Explorer really goes into, maybe a two-color deck that wants to get a little bit of extra tempo, but is happy to draw some cards late, maybe a more mid-range deck. And Rampant Growth really fixes your mana is the really important thing, so it goes into a green splashing all over the place deck, or whatever the environment supports. So I think that goes to say, I do think that actually in your cube, it seems... Explorer seems pretty powerful because you have been pushing green mid-range a lot more. And having a card that drawing late can not be just a dead card because you don't need to ramp anymore, but just draws you something new that's relevant. I think it would be pretty good.
Yeah, it's going back in, I think, and I don't... This is a perfect example of why this game is so interesting to me. I don't know. I still, sitting to this day, holding this card in my hand, don't know how to rate it compared to all the Rampant Growths. And I do run a couple of Rampant Growth style effects in my cube. They are very reliable, which is why I like them, but they are reliably terrible in the late game. That is, right. You just don't want to draw Rampant Growth when you are looking for spells, which is true of pretty much all ramp, so that's not a huge knock against it. But the ceiling of Explore is incredible. The ceiling is that it is exactly a Rampant Growth in the early turns of the game. If you draw a land and play a land, then that's exactly the same as if you Rampant Growth, except you didn't get to choose, obviously. So to your point, there's a slightly less fixing ability, with the possibility of just cycling late. If you just threw cycling on Rampant Growth, it'd be incredible, and Explore is many times that. But sometimes it's also, you're on 2 mana sources, and you have no other lands in hand, and you cast your Explorer, and then it does nothing. So I still to this day don't know how to rate it. It really highlights for me how much card evaluation is just probabilities. We could describe the exact scenarios in which Rampant Growth is better than Explorer, and which Explorer is better than Rampant Growth, and the only thing we would disagree on if we didn't agree on the evaluation was just how likely those situations were to arise. And for all my playing Magic with my cube, for all of my thinking about Magic, I still don't know if Explorer or Rampant Growth is better. I did run a poll, though. Most people like Rampant Growth, according to my Twitter poll.
It's a lot more predictable. People like that.
I think it's more iconic. I think it's part of why I should have. I wish I had done this. Now I feel like I've kind of tainted the subject pool by already running one poll. I think if I had run Explorer versus Edge of Autumn, the results might have been very different.
Yeah, but that's a different card.
How different is it, really?
Well, I think it's actually a good deal closer to Explore, but I think people get really disturbed by the sacrifice of land text.
I think Edge of Autumn is better than both, frankly. I think it's better than Explorer and better than Rampant Growth, but most people don't agree with me. Most people don't like that card, so that's my Cube card of the week. Everyone check out Edge of Autumn. Did you want to tell us what you're cooking, Anthony?
I haven't been doing too much that's exciting. I have made some chicken stock and some pickled mushrooms. I'm sort of ramping up to make a couple batches of ramen noodles. One of my favorite little things I made this week was some hot and sour silken tofu, which is a Chinese dish with chili oil and soy sauce and preserved Chinese vegetable. And it's just delicious, especially in these hot summer days.
All right, you heard Anthony. He's ramping up to some nudes over there in his apartment in quarantine times. Ramping up to some nudes. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. I'm not going to ask people to do this every time at the end of an episode, but every once in a while, I do want to remind people that if you like the show, I would love for you to share it with other people in the Cube community. Tell your friends about it. If you have people that you think might enjoy the show, just post it around. That's the best thing you can do to help us when we're trying to find our audience in the early days of the podcast. If you want to go and leave a review on iTunes or whatever, that's also cool, but frankly, I don't think it really matter that much anymore. I think it's kind of a thing of the old days. But yeah, if you like the show, tell a friend. And if you have any questions or comments, you can email them to mail@luckypaper.co. Thank you to DJ James Nasty for all of our music, the intro, the outro, the stingers, all of it. He's the greatest. Go shake your butt to some James Nasty tunes, and everyone stay safe out there.
I gotta go make a rotisserie draft pick.